The other thing we're waiting on, which brings me to my very special guest, is we're waiting on the Supreme Court to see whether they take up a case out of North Carolina. Also, a case I should disclose my firm is involved in litigating, which is the North Carolina redistricting case. And for those of you who don't remember the backdrop there, North Carolina's Republican legislature passed a map that was an avowed, or not avowed, it was a clear partisan gerrymander. The state Supreme Court struck it down under the state constitutional standard, saying it failed to meet the state constitution's requirements. And the plaintiffs there, and there are some other cases as well, but that's the one that most people are focusing on right now. The defendants there, this Republican legislature has gone to the U.S. Supreme Court to try to undo that under what is called the Independent State Legislature doctrine or Independent State Legislature theory. And I am joined now by Daniel Squadron, who, for those of you who don't know, I first met him, at least in passing, when he worked for Senator Schumer, now the majority leader of the U.S. Senate. He was not at that time. And then Daniel went on to serve in the New York State Senate, where he was a leader on a number of issues, including those involving voting rights in a state that very much needs that kind of leadership. And he became the co-founder and now the exec director of the States Project. And this is a really, really important organization. For those of you who have not checked it out, I urge you to do so. It works to get people involved in their with their state legislature and win majorities win legislative majorities, because state legislatures play such an important role in our process. Daniel recently wrote a piece for Democracy Docket called "The Future of Our Democracy Will Come Down to State Legislatures," warning about the dangers that Republican-controlled legislatures are posing to our democracy when it comes to voter suppression, election certification, and election subversion. So welcome, Daniel, to our spaces.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here.
And let me kick off by asking what may be the obvious question, but maybe not. You had this amazing trajectory. You worked for Senator Schumer. You served in the U.S. State Senate, and now you have sort of dedicated so much of your time to the States Project. Why is that?
Marc, let's be honest. I had a trajectory working for Chuck Schumer, co-writing his book, and then I ran for the state Senate in New York. I mean, if we're going to be honest about when I went off track. But actually, the reason I ran for the state Senate in 2008, I took on a 30-year incumbent, is very similar to the reason I left the state Senate in 2017 to co-found the States Project with Adam Pritzker. And it's really that state legislatures are just about the worst or most challenging place in American civic life, and have really been left, I believe, for 50 years to the worst forces in American politics. So you look around New York State in 2008, the New York State Senate was the absolute worst place to be. And that's what was appealing. That proved true over the next few years, but also we were able to get some good work done. Also, I think really proved the point. We had a bunch of Democrats who kept Republicans in the majority for years with basically no consequence, including from Democratic leadership in our state. And, I left in 2017 because there was this idea that Donald Trump was the problem, and that his ideology and his way of describing democracy and civic life and who's an American were new and had sort of sprouted from the moment he descended the golden escalator. The truth is, we had seen that in legislature for years. We had seen the impact of ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, for years. They murdered Trayvon Martin and threw up and down the issue list. And, I thought this idea that Donald Trump was the problem and therefore getting rid of him was the solution was missing the real risk to our democracy and our country and our crisis. And Adam Pritzker, my co-founder, was really getting involved in politics, and to my shock, got very excited about this idea of state legislatures, as I am whenever anyone is shocked. And the other group that got really excited at the same time was a group of giving circles. Groups of people, mostly women, came together and they started giving groups. They got their own webpage, their own name, to raise money to flip state legislatures. If we had been having this conversation, Marc, 10 years ago, and we said, there are hundreds of giving circles with tens of thousands of donors trying to flip state legislatures around the country, we would have thought it was a joke, not possible. But I think it's because increasingly people really see the importance.
And so tell me about the state's project today, right? Like you talked about, the reason why it was founded in the, what I'll call the Trump era. We're now arguably still in the Trump era or the post-Trump era or the big lie era, call it what you want. Like how has that affected the work, and what is the trajectory of that work?
I think a lot of people thought before January 6th that the moment Trump took the helicopter ride, the crisis would be over.
Right. Exactly.
And I had been a little bit of a tinfoil hat figure, I think, maybe in 17, 18, and 19, saying not just it's not about Trump's about states, but also states could well determine the presidency. Not legitimately, but nonetheless. And it's been a really interesting experience because, we sort of said post-Trump era groups like ours that had started, does all the momentum, does all the energy melt away? You might have had that same question about democracy, Docket.
Yeah.
And where we sat, suddenly people said, Trump's gone, but, more people every month believe the big lie. Trump's gone, but reproductive health is about to be made illegal. And, this isn't just a Mitch McConnell story. So it has actually been this really interesting period of having been, frankly, screaming into a cave for most of my political career. People say, oh, yeah, states are so important. You need them to win Congress. By the way, that's true. But, full stop. Or states are so important. That's where Barack Obama and Chuck Schumer, Stacey Abrams, and others got their start. Yes, but it's more. And suddenly people are coming up to me and saying, boy, states are so important. That's never happened in 15 years of doing state legislative work. And so the states project today is very focused on winning or defending governing power everywhere it's at risk. And it's at risk in a lot of places. Every swing state in America has a unified Republican legislature in which no more than 15% of Republicans have ever even said Joe Biden is president. So they have a unified Republican legislature that doesn't believe in the democracy. Every swing state in America. And then there's a lot of swing states where we have control, Maine, Nevada, the Alaska House through a bipartisan coalition that are really under threat in what's going to be a tough year and could easily become one of those threats to our democracy.
So you make a point that it's really interesting because I want you to amplify on this. You make a point about the state legislatures that I make about Congress, but I have never connected to state legislatures, which is I always say to folks, the way I try to illustrate to people like where we are going, like in terms of Trump and the Republicans, is I say, imagine what the median Republican House member looked like in 2020. Now ask yourself what they look like today. It hasn't gotten better, it's gotten worse. In other words, the House has gotten more and more extreme, even within the ecosystem of a fairly gerrymandered, narrow playing field. And I guess I had assumed, because we had been hearing about ALEC all this time, that was already baked in the cake among Republican legislatures. But is your sense that they have gotten worse since 2020?
Yeah, I think it's harder for the few moderates to survive. So I think it was the majority leader in the Michigan House who, chose, the number two figure in the House, who decided not to run again because said, this idea that politicians are going to decide the election is so offensive. Or, in Arizona in the Senate, one Republican in the Arizona Senate really opposed that fraud. He's not running again in Arizona. It even turned out he could run for the House. You can go back and forth. And so I think you're seeing a purging. And then it's, like even if you take like an issue like vaccines and just, protecting yourself against COVID, you have folks who ran being attacked by anti-vax movements who were Republicans who today are on the record against COVID vaccines. So there is both, I think, a radicalization happening and a purging happening. And, what it means for the democracy, for the Independent State Legislature doctrine, and why the States Project really believes 2022 is our last chance to ensure a free and fair presidential election ever in our future, is the idea that you can have a coalition of, Mitt Romneys and Lisa Murkowski's in every one of these chambers even 15% of Republicans is very concerning.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about the independent state legislature doctrine, independent state legislature theory, and kind of how you think it fits into this.
Well, again, I'll put on my tinfoil hat for a moment because, I actually think, you started talking about a bunch of cases, including gerrymandering. I actually think that if you look at the three big movements that they are talking about, they all add up to a strategy to supposedly justify invocation of the Independent State Legislature. So gerrymandering, which they're continuing to hold on to. This case, would allow some fair districts potentially, like in Michigan and other places, to be redrawn unfairly, is all about maintaining Republican unified control in swing state legislatures. Second, anti-voter laws. Of course, anti-voter laws, and I wouldn't talk to either you or your audience about them. You're all much more experts than we are. But, they have two effects. They might, in a close election, swing the election. But they have three effects, really. They certainly say who we are as a country and sort of define who we are civically and are very important for that reason. But, they have a third effect, which is they make those of us who want elections that people can participate in go into an election feeling suspicious and unhappy. So between the increase in support for the big lie and the impact that anti-voter laws are having for those of us who want to have open elections, means everyone's going to go into the 2024 presidential election frustrated and doubtful. Then the third is, Steve Bannon's big push on election administrators. This one really confused me because the election administrators, they're very important, and we'll talk about why, but it's hard for them to steal the election. Right? Brad Raffensperger probably would have been reined in by a court at some point. Certainly if he tried to find the votes, I can tell you as a former New York State legislator, that's the time when a lot of my colleagues would go to prison, the moment they committed a crime while everyone was watching. So, but here's what the administrators can do that's incredibly damaging: create chaos, delays, make it about your work, the work of courts, which creates doubt. I believe all three of these things: maintaining unified control of state legislatures, anti-voter laws that create doubt and frustration about the election, and then election administrators that create chaos and delays, are all designed to justify invoking Rehnquist's Bush v. Gore framework, which was they had to stop counting votes in Florida to ensure the votes would be counted from Florida. Quite tortured logic that he used. But I believe that all of this is about creating a circumstance where state legislatures, between election day in 2024 and the presidential safe harbor deadline, when electors have to be accepted by Congress, to swoop in and say, it's all so confusing, everyone's so frustrated, we're going to step in, nullify our state's voters, and instead throw the electors wherever we want. So we believe that is the risk. Today, 310 electoral votes are in states controlled by Republicans. Arizona, Michigan, whoever's elected in November will be deciding whether or not to pursue this strategy in 2024. Pennsylvania and New Hampshire, whoever's elected in 24 takes office a little early.
So I've made this argument, which I think is not exactly the same, but similar to the argument that you're making. And I think the central premise of what you're saying is really important, which is that people have this idea that the way in which elections will be subverted is, one candidate gets 60% of the vote, one candidate gets 40% of the vote, and some official just says, "Oh, I think 40 is higher than 60." Like that just doesn't happen. Like that's not going to happen. What Republicans need to pull off election subversion is they need a predicate of fraud, irregularity, uncertainty. So the way I describe it sometimes, they need to create categories of ballots or categories of activity that create the doubt upon which you can then build the election subversion. And so that all of these voter suppression laws serve kind of multiple purposes, you point out. One of them is to actually affect who can vote and who can't. One is to dissuade people from voting. But another one is to create a range of doubt over activity that allows them to then claim widespread irregularities. And that part of what I think Republicans learned from 2020 is that they didn't effectively lay that groundwork. Like they were quite inept at it, trying to lay the predicate groundwork so that, before the election, it was just Donald Trump like running around screaming about crazy stuff. And then after the election, it was like just a series of a few dozen lawsuits that were quickly dismissed. But that what they're planning for 2022, 2024 is to be much more methodical in laying that groundwork that then creates that predicate. And you're right. If you go look at the court's decision in 2000, and this is a little wonky, but people now think of Bush versus Gore as primarily an equal protection case. It really, what the Republicans did is laid it out as a due process case, right? That there were like all of these like irregularities, right? This was irregular, this was irregular, this was irregular, and this was irregular. And so I agree with you. So the question is, what can we do at the state, with dealing with understanding that threat? What can we do about it with respect to state legislatures?
I think there are two things. I actually think talking about it, this is something that, I know we've checked in about in the past. Talking about it makes sense, not to normalize it, not to give them ideas. As, I've said, I believe they already have the ideas. But because that predicate is harder to build if it's shown for what it is, which is a planned fiction. So I think that's really important to really understand how real this is and to understand how real the threat is in this country. When you have the Supreme Court validate an idea, you have, a media ecosystem that creates a lot of noise, and then you have elected officials acting supposedly under the authority of the Supreme Court. So that is a real threat that could become very normal if to use your word again, predicate feels legit. The second thing is, let's win some power in some places. We have power in the White House, both chambers of Congress, and yet a couple of members of the Supreme Court and a bunch of state legislatures seem to be deciding most of the policy of this country. Well, that is going to be a huge problem for a free and fair presidential election. I believe it's a huge problem for, America and Americans. And let's do something about it. We can. In Arizona, in both chambers, one seat in either chamber would break their unified control of that legislature. That changes the balance of power significantly. You see this in Alaska. We have Republicans and Democrats working together in the House against extremism and doing some pretty good things and stopping a lot of bad things. Michigan, 3 seats in each chamber and better districts than you've had in Michigan because they're fair districts now, thanks to a referendum. That's why all these pieces work together.
And just so that we're all, because people want to slow this down so people can. So Arizona, 1 seat either chamber. Right. Alaska, you said is
Alaska. We control the House again. I don't think we're getting the electoral votes in Alaska based on the votes of the people. But
now, Michigan, when you talk about fair maps, are you talking about the state House, state Senate, both? What's the state of play in Michigan?
Yeah, so both chambers have fair maps, so better maps than they had in 2020. I think conventional wisdom is that maybe the electoral environment will be worse than it was in 2020, but whether it is or not, that could still change. We know the maps are a lot fairer. In fact, the Michigan Senate, both the Michigan Senate and House are really interesting opportunities, even in a tough year. Pennsylvania, you also have fair, Pennsylvania House especially. Everyone's up in the Pennsylvania House this year. Half of Pennsylvania Senate is up. You have fairer maps than you had. And as
Pennsylvania is like a weird thing because Pennsylvania, like, you would think that the Pennsylvania House would be, kind of reasonable. Like you'd think the Pennsylvania legislature would be like less like, I don't know. I don't want to, less like Texas and more like, closer to like New York, New Jersey. But it's
the old cliche about how Pennsylvania is organized with Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. By the way, just a quick correction: Michigan, thanks, but we actually won to give you a sense of the environment. We actually won a special election in Michigan, so the House is down to 2. Thank you to Simone and our team for that clarification. You can win even in a tough year in state legislative races. They're very localized. Yeah. But Pennsylvania is a place where we can go both in 22 and 24. As I said before, it's a weird quirk where the lawmakers elected in November take office in December. And there's a lot of seats to hold there. It's 9 in the House, I believe. New Hampshire is a place where we held the majority off and on, won in 2018, lost in 2020. big swings in New Hampshire. I think New Hampshire had the biggest swing between the gubernatorial and the presidential result. It's a place that where so a lot of this party, the tightness of party voting is from a different era still. So those are all important opportunities for the electoral votes. Let's say on the other side, in a very bad year, Nevada, people don't remember, but Nevada was a purple state very recently, and certainly is in the U.S. Senate level. You have two chambers there fighting to maintain control. Maine, that in Maine today, the House feels totally safe. In 2016, a majority of today's Maine House districts would have voted for Trump.
Wow.
There's a real challenge in Maine, even though we have a trifecta there. And, then there are some other things, again, less probably about electoral votes, but about other critical issues, life and death issues, like reproductive rights, like jobs and others. North Carolina, Governor Cooper's been able to do some good work with the Republican legislature because they don't have a supermajority. They could, in a bad year, take that supermajority back. So the States Project is working in 10 states in which we're trying to either build or defend governing power. 5 or 6 of those states are going to be the states that determine whether the billion-dollar presidential election is going to be upheld legitimately. And the other states are states where, you have cumulatively millions of people who for whom major policy will change. In the last 10 years, more progress and damage has been done in state legislatures on just about every issue in this country than in Congress. And I just think we have to be thinking about that more.
So one of the states that I think always surprises people, and I think is one of your states, is Minnesota. Like, people think Minnesota is like pretty blue, and yet that is a split control, as I recall, and with in a good year, Democrats could do well there. In a more mixed year, it would be tougher.
It really speaks to the split strategy that we have to pursue this year, and understand it's a long game. Minnesota is both an opportunity to gain a trifecta and lose a chamber.
Right.
Exactly. And you know what? We have to play for that, and we have to be willing to stick with this. This is what we say to our giving circles. These folks are going out to their networks and putting themselves in line. In 1972, when Paul Weyrich founded ALEC, he didn't say we'll do this in 74 is a good year. 74 was a pretty bad year, as you may recall, for them. And this is about building that infrastructure. And so if the year starts to turn, Minnesota Senate on the table. If it doesn't, Minnesota House on the table.
Yeah. So we're going to go to people's questions in a minute, but I have a few just sort of random follow-ups. But if you want to ask a question, you can either raise your hand and ask it live, or you can DM it to Democracy Docket. But just a few sort of other questions before we get to what's on people's mind. Number one, people are almost certainly going to ask about Florida and Texas, because those are the two most asked about states generally on Spaces. How do you think about those states from a state legislative standpoint?
Well, States Project was in Florida and Texas in 2020, and was feeling very excited. A lot of the data and polling, as we all know, it's the same story as at every other level. It's coming back close. Florida ended up not really even being close, if we're going to be honest. But, Texas was. So Texas, we ended up netting no new seats in the Texas House. But if 11,000 votes across 9 districts in a state where 11 million people voted had flipped, we would have won the House.
Wow.
And by the way, just to give you a sense of how close it is, you take Florida out, but you take Pennsylvania, Texas, Michigan, the states we've been talking about. Across 14 chambers, 46,000 votes in states where 39 million people voted. Flipping, we would have won every chamber we were working in but the Florida House. Wow. Every single one. This is so close. This year, with new maps, Texas and Florida are both hard. But one thing the States Project would like to be thinking more about, and in a world where more people are focused on state legislatures and where this is a bigger movement, is how we can also be building multi-cycle power in these places and capacity. This is not going to be popular with a lot of your listeners, but I think that sometimes when you have a great state lawmaker, in a competitive congressional district, let them hold the seat if it's a competitive legislature as well, and let them recruit another great congressional candidate. Let's not constantly hollow out the best state lawmakers in the most important seats, because we need to build this over time. So Texas and Florida this year are not the states projects main states. In Texas, we were actually involved with them to help in some early infrastructure building. And in Florida, we're maintaining our relationships, looking for opportunities. The other state that comes up a lot for us is Georgia, where obviously a critical swing state, Republican legislature, very, very tough legislative map. And really a sign of sort of how you can build power in a state statewide. And obviously that's game changing, and still have some work to do to build power to make state legislatures competitive because of the geography.
Yeah, so that brings me to my second question, which is one of the things that I have two more questions before we go to other folks' questions, and both of them reflect frustrations. So here you go. Frustration number one: on the right, they have understood the need for a long-term, long-range commitment to funding, ALEC and their version of what I call anti-democracy voter suppression. And on our side, frankly, it seems much harder to get people's long-term attention on making democracy their top issue. Like, the right, like, this is all they do every day, is they are planning the next, how to implement the big lie. And on the left, we, not to say those other issues are not important, they're vitally important, but I feel like Democrats don't understand that if we do not have a functioning democracy and we do not have good people in the halls of power, the rest of it is just like not going to matter, because we're not going to get any of those other reforms. So what's going on there?
This is like an old state Senate district, just like local district lesson, which is, once something happens or is perceived to happen, the coalition against it is a lot greater. So, there would be folks, who would care about something in the community, and they're very active, very engaged people. And then the thing would happen, and suddenly, you'd have 1,000 people say, how could this happen? I think that's a little bit true with democracy. On their side, they think they've been fed this lie that an election has already been stolen. That's why that's a growing, air quotes, democracy movement. On our side, we're saying this multi-step situation that involves fringe constitutional theory, a bunch of lawmakers who are, not celebrities, and Mallory McMorrow is now, and it's great to see that happen, but generally are not celebrities. And I am certain that the movement to be furious and undo this, if this happens in 2025, will be huge. I just believe that after an election is stolen in that way, the impact of that movement is vastly weaker and possibly too late.
Yeah, which brings me to my last question. So I wrote something a few months ago that basically chastised Democratic-controlled states for not doing enough. Like, why can't every Democratic legislature or every trifecta pass better voting laws? Like, there's no state that can't have better voting laws. And there are some Democratic-controlled states that have actually pretty crappy voting laws. And why can't we get, I'm going to point to my home state of New York, born in Lenox Hill Hospital, grew up in Valley Stream and in Rockland County. And I know you are, you've been in and around New York politics. And sure, the voting laws have gotten better, but they're still not great. Like, they're not as good as they could be. Massachusetts, Paige, remind me what Massachusetts let expire. Was it same-day registration?
No excuse mail-in voting. And they have let it expire for months and have kind of just started getting around to passing legislation.
Like, what's going on there?
It's until recently, voter laws were a bipartisan issue. You had folks in sort of established power who liked voting exactly as it was, and you had folks trying to undo that power who wanted to change it in both parties. And generally, the folks in power had the majority, certainly in the state legislature. You always like look at, there's a couple of states where there's a strategic attempt, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, maybe, to really have bad voting systems. And then New York And you look at voting percentages, you look at, time for reporting. It's like, it's some combination of those states always. And I really do think it's a vestige of a structure that isn't partisan and is not about, theft in the way that we're now at risk of, is about just maintenance of historic power structures. And, I would say the consequence of just being okay with that is what we're seeing now, because it just creates more cynicism. It makes it harder to understand, not to understand, it makes it harder to believe the good faith players on either side of this. I think we need to be honest about it. Like, there have been moments that mail-in voting has been better for Republicans, and it's still a good policy.
Yes.
There have been moments that Democrats have purposely created barriers to voting, and that's shameful and should be called out.
Yep.
And, I think actually, in a world where there's a less salient issue from a partisan point of view and a more salient issue from a voter point of view, we'd be better off. And, we just never got there.
Yep. All right, Paige, how can people ask questions, and who do we got?
There are two ways to ask questions. You can hit the request to speak button here on Spaces, or you can DM your question to Democracy Docket. But our first question is from Twitter, from Carol, who asks, in Otero County, New Mexico, Republican commissioners are refusing to certify primary results. How does that fit into the larger framework of the Independent State Legislature doctrine and election subversion?
Go ahead. Counselor, I'm actually not an attorney, though.
Okay.
I act like one.
So what we're seeing in New Mexico is a county election board simply refusing to certify elections because they have become convinced of the big lie. I mean, they're not certifying any elections. They're not certifying the Democrats. They're not certifying the Republicans. They're simply refusing to certify the elections because they have unspecified beliefs that the voting machines are not to be believed. So it's an example of where the big lie has seeped into the ethos of these local election officials, and there's now litigation to force them to certify the election. But, to Daniel, I think to your earlier point, is if you start to see that in a 2024, even when you then have the courts starting to get involved, what does that do to the argument when state legislatures say, hey, we need to step in here?
I'd actually love to. My theory has been that the courts probably will do the right thing, but it just creates this sort of narrative that the courts have done it, not the normal process. Is that are you pretty confident the court will force the right outcome?
Yeah. The New Mexico Supreme Court is forcing them to do it, but as you say, that then just feeds the narrative of the people who believe in the big lie.
It's a test case.
Yeah,
that's right.
Karina asks, how do we fight for control of state legislatures when gerrymandering can make it really hard to do so?
You can't give up. So we have a breed of optimism at the States Project that is, tomorrow can certainly be better than today. That it is, we are at the cusp of a bunch of crises, but we also know that in this country and in politics, engagement, enthusiasm, targeted focus can lead to great outcomes and improvements. That is the story of our country. That is the story of politics. That is the story of the moment we're in. We are on the cusp of some great things happening in this country and great things happening in state legislatures. I was in California yesterday hearing about just amazing climate and growth, business growth, simultaneously legislation there. You see some of the great things that have happened in New York or in Maine. Purple state, once they get control, they've done great things for the people of Maine. Gerrymandering and voter suppression are designed to make it harder. They work even better when they make one seat in Arizona, 3 seats and 2 seats in Michigan. I have been involved in state legislative elections. Up until the last week, you want to be in the best position to win because you never know what will happen. Like, don't let gerrymandering be an excuse to let yourself off the hook.
Yeah, because the turnout in these elections, as you pointed out, with the 11,000 vote example, I mean, we're talking about places where hyper-localized issues and hyper-localized turnout can really make a difference.
You had Lori Pahusky in 2020, incumbent under real attack, knock 9,000 doors safely, but despite COVID, she decided to knock. She outperformed like everyone or close to everyone in the state, and certainly outperformed the top of the ticket by point. She held a seat that she should have lost. It is doable.
Page.
Brian asks, how does the Electoral College fit into all of this?
You need a majority of the Electoral College to win the presidency. And today, if state legislatures are determining where presidential electors go, if state legislatures, not voters, determine it, they have 310 presidential electors, and we have, I think, 228.
Yeah. So explain why that. Explain people who are listening and may not understand this. How is it that the state legislatures come into play in presidential elections in a way they don't in House and Senate elections?
First of all, let's be very clear: they should not. The idea that the
Right.
framers gave a unique power to state legislatures absent governors is so bizarre that we just need to kind of take a second. Like, hey, look at this ridiculous idea. Here's what it is. The ridiculous idea is that a combination of Article 1, I think Section 4 of the Constitution, and Article 2, some ways more centrally, give state legislatures themselves a unique constitutional authority to determine the manner of selection of presidential electors, basically before, during, or after an election. Which
is crazy.
That the idea of voters being involved in presidential elections is simply a decision of the state legislature that governors, state courts, no one has oversight over, and they can decide we're not going to do that anymore. By the way, every single state has done that since 1876. I think in 1876 you had one messy state, but I think other than that, since 1824, my memory is every single state has used, voters to determine electors, and I don't believe any state has ever acted in a way where the legislature operates independent of the governor. So that's the wild idea, that state legislatures have a uniquely imbued power, constitutional authority on presidential electors that is unreviewable by state courts, governors, or anyone else. If you believe that, then you have to look at who controls state legislatures. Republicans control Georgia, Arizona, Michigan, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, North Carolina, Wisconsin.
And this is where, just to bring it back, Daniel, to the point you made at the beginning, because I think this is really the important connection. This is why when you say that the composition of the Republicans in the state legislatures, I think you said 15%. Acknowledge Joe Biden won. That's why the composition of these legislatures, even if Democrats don't control them, is so important.
Every seat matters here. Every seat means that there's some person who happens to be a Republican who is more on the hook for whether our democracy continues past 2024. That's real. It's actually, speaking of optimism, it's a certain kind of optimism. This might be a moment to break some of this partisan poisonousness and build some coalitions around, let's have voters decide presidential elections. And, I think we need to be open to that idea. It also means that we better fight like crazy and win every possible seat we can in every one of these chambers, because every seat we win is one less person who we need to convince to do something that might be political suicide in their party, but will be life support and life saving for the democracy. Right.
And you gave an example, I think, from Arizona of one legislator.
Yes, but you know how many Arizona legislators are running, Arizona state senators are running for re-election who have ever said a version of Joe Biden as president? 0. It's a little bit better in Michigan. Give credit where it's due. A little better in Michigan, a little better in Pennsylvania, but it's very close.
Yeah. Paige, we have time for one more.
We have time for one more question, and it's our favorite question from Samuel, who asked, how can I get involved and how do I help?
Thanks for asking, Samuel. I thought you'd never ask. So statesproject.org is our website. You can see more statistics and details on state legislatures than you ever realized you wanted to. I promise you, state legislatures are like underground hip hop or indie rock. The more you know, the more drawn to it you are. It's just great, fascinating, powerful, impactful stuff. And you can get involved there in the best possible way, which is actually do something yourself by starting a giving circle, which means it's your group. You get your own webpage, you get your own name, you get a logo, you get to choose which state. All of the dollars, 100% of the dollars the giving circles raise go out the door to increase budgets in the state that the giving circles choose. So, what we always say is, and this is actually a great final point, $1 billion presidential election, maybe a little bit more. Congressional races, can be upwards of $10 million. Individual state legislative races, like these ones in Arizona, are a couple $100,000. Game changing. $10,000 is an enormous deal. I remember when we first started in 2017, Adam and I got started and we had just a few dollars to give to Virginia. And I called the Virginia candidates person. I think we were given like $5,000 or $6,000, like tears on the phone of gratitude. I just spent 10 hours on the phone trying to raise money. Now I can go out and knock on doors. And so rather than be an observer to the destruction of your democracy or feel like this is terrifying, I've got to tear my hair out, but I can't do anything, these forces are too powerful. Weirdly, in state legislatures, we have what we have because so few people have been involved. Every new person is marginally a vastly higher percentage of new people involved than at any other level of government. So go to statesproject.org, consider a giving circle, tell everyone you know, make sure that the media is covering this and that folks know that as this plan plays out, it's not because there's some crisis or some predicate. It's because this is a strategy to steal the democracy. We have to win elections in 22 in every state we can. We have to stick with it through 24, even if 22 is a tough year. And we've got to make sure they don't claim they were forced into this destruction of our democracy.